Look at a map of the modern Middle East, and Iraq seems permanent, ancient even. This is the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the place where writing was invented, where the first cities rose, where the first laws were carved into stone. Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization itself. It feels like it has always been there, a nation as old as history. But here's the thing, the country itself, the borders, the flag, the government, the very idea of Iraq as a single state, is barely older than your great-grandparents. Before 1921, there was no Iraq, not as a country, not on any map, not in any government office, not in the mind of anyone living there. There were three separate Ottoman provinces, Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra, with different populations, different loyalties, and no shared national identity at all. So who drew the lines? Who decided that these three provinces would become one nation? And why? Of all the questions those decisions could have answered, did the flow of oil end up mattering more than the will of the people who actually lived there? Before we go back to the beginning, one thing needs to be said clearly. This is not a story about a religion, or an ethnicity, or a people. It's not a story about who deserves blame today, and it has nothing to do with any conflict happening in the region right now. This is a story about a handful of state decisions made by specific officials, in a specific year, for specific strategic reasons. Decisions you can trace in the official records, the meeting minutes, the telegrams. 1921 is history. What happens today is not what this video is about. So let's go back to where the story actually starts, not with a war and not with a king, but with three provinces that had never been one country at all. For nearly 400 years, the land that would become Iraq was not a country. It was three provinces of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottomans themselves barely governed them as a single unit. In the north sat Mosul, a province of mountains and plains, home to Kurds, Arabs, Assyrians, Turkmen, and a patchwork of religious communities that had lived side by side, and sometimes in tension, for centuries. Mosul looked toward Anatolia and Syria as much as it looked toward Baghdad. In the center sat Baghdad itself, once the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, a city whose name still carried the memory of a golden age of science and scholarship centuries earlier, but which by the early 1900s was a provincial Ottoman capital, administered by Turkish officials, taxed for Constantinople's benefit, and largely disconnected from any idea of self-rule. In the south sat Basra, a port province on the Persian Gulf, its economy built on river trade, dates, and access to the sea, with a population that leaned heavily Shia Arab and looked toward the Gulf and toward Persia as much as toward the Ottoman north. Three provinces, three different economic lives, three different centers of gravity. The Ottoman government in Constantinople ruled them the way an empire rules distant territory, through governors, garrisons, and tax collectors, not through any shared civic identity. Here is the number that matters. As late as 1914, there was no Arabic word in common use that meant Iraq as a political unit, encompassing all three provinces together. The name existed as a loose geographic term for the region, much the way someone today might say, the Balkans, without meaning a single country. It described a place, not a nation. So when historians say Iraq was created in 1921, this is what they mean literally. Not a change of government, not independence. The stitching together, for the first time in history, of three provinces that had never been governed as one. That stitching didn't happen because the people of Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra asked for it. It happened because a war was coming that would collapse the empire holding all three, and because, buried under one of those provinces, sat something the rest of the world had just started to care about more than almost anything else. The Ottoman Empire had ruled this land for 4 centuries. It would not survive the war that was about to begin. In 1914, the Ottoman Empire entered the First World War on the side of Germany. For Britain, this turned Mesopotamia from a distant province of a rival empire into an active battlefield and an opportunity. But as British troops fought their way up the Tigris and the Euphrates, something else was happening far from any battlefield. In offices in London, Paris, and Cairo, British and French officials were making promises about this same land, to different people, in different documents that could not all be kept at once. The first promise came in 1915, in a series of letters between the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, and Sharif Hussein of Mecca. Britain encouraged an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule, in exchange for support of Arab independence across a broad stretch of Ottoman territory once the war was won. Hussein's sons, including a young prince named Faisal, would lead that revolt. The promise was independence. The second promise came in 1916, and it contradicted the first. In a secret agreement between British diplomat Mark Sykes and his French counterpart François-Georges Picot, Britain and France drew their own lines across the same Ottoman territory, dividing it into zones of direct control and zones of influence, with no mention of the independence promised to the Arabs a year earlier. Mesopotamia, including Baghdad and Basra, was marked for British control. The third promise came in 1917. The Balfour Declaration committed Britain to supporting a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, a separate promise, layered on top of the first two, about a different piece of the same collapsing empire. 3 documents, 3 different futures promised for overlapping pieces of land, and all 3 were still on the table when the war ended in 1918, and the Ottoman Empire began to fall apart for good. This is the part of the story that rarely gets simplified honestly. The contradictions weren't an accident of wartime chaos. They were the predictable result of an empire making commitments to multiple parties for the same territory, under the assumption that whoever won the war would sort out the details later. Somebody was going to have to sort out those details, and by 1921, man in London's colonial office would be handed exactly that job, with a map that didn't yet have a country called Iraq drawn on it at all. While the war was still being fought, something else was happening beneath the surface of Mesopotamia that would turn the 3 Ottoman provinces into a prize more valuable than the old imperial prestige that had justified their control for centuries. In 1901, a British financier named William Knox D'Arcy had negotiated a concession in Persia, the right to search for and extract oil across a vast stretch of territory. For 7 years, he found nothing. The money ran out. He was nearly bankrupt. But in 1908, in a place called Masjed-e-Soliman in the Khuzestan region, D'Arcy's team struck oil in commercial quantities, massive quantities. By 1909, D'Arcy's operation had been reorganized into the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, or APOC, and by 1914, the British government itself had bought a controlling interest, 53% of the shares. This was not a private investment, it was a state decision, and it was driven by a single man's vision of Britain's future. That man was Winston Churchill. In 1913, as First Lord of the Admiralty, the man who controlled the Royal Navy, Churchill had made a choice that would reshape British power. The Navy, then the largest in the world, had always run on coal. Coal was reliable. Coal was British. But oil was faster, more powerful, and more efficient. If Britain could secure a dedicated supply of oil, the Navy would have an advantage over every rival on the ocean. Churchill went to Parliament and made the case directly. Britain needed to look out upon the wide expanse of the oil regions of the world. Only British-controlled oil could protect British interests. Parliament agreed. In 1914, by an act of Parliament, the British government became a majority shareholder in APOC. The decision was made at the highest level of British power, and it was final. Britain would not leave its oil supply to chance or to private merchants. But here is the detail that mattered most for the story of Iraq. The richest, most accessible oil fields in the region were not in Persia. They were under the soil of Mosul, the northern Ottoman province that was about to become part of something called Iraq. Before the war even ended, there were already rumors. The Turkish Petroleum Company, originally a German Ottoman venture, held the concession rights to the oil under Mosul. If Mosul fell under German control after the war, Germany would control access to those reserves. If Mosul fell under Ottoman or French control, Britain would be locked out. If Mosul fell under British control, the British government, which had just spent millions buying into APOC in Persia, would finally have the direct, guaranteed, government-owned source of cheap oil that Churchill had promised Parliament it needed. By 1920, even before the borders of Iraq had been drawn, the outcome was already written in oil. The question was no longer whether Mosul would be part of British Iraq. The question was how to make that arrangement look like something other than what it actually was. On March 12, 1921, a convoy of official cars arrived at the Semiramis Hotel on the banks of the Nile River in Cairo. Emerging from those cars was what may have been the greatest concentration of imperial expertise ever assembled in a single place at a single time. At the center was Winston Churchill, now promoted to Secretary of State for the colonies, no longer running the Navy, but now running the entire colonial apparatus of the British Empire. Flanking him were figures who had already passed into the realm of legend. There was T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, the man who had helped lead the Arab revolt during the war, and who had promised so much to Arab leaders about their future independence. There was Gertrude Bell, a British explorer and archaeologist who spoke Arabic, understood the region better than almost any British official alive, and who would spend the next decade being called the uncrowned Queen of Iraq for her influence over Iraqi affairs. There was Sir Percy Cox, the High Commissioner for Mesopotamia, who had spent years on the ground dealing with the chaos of occupation and the rising tide of Arab nationalism. And there were Air Force commanders, military engineers, financial officials, the brain trust of empire, gathered to solve a crisis. The crisis was simple. The British position in the Middle East was hemorrhaging money, keeping tens of thousands of troops stationed across Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan was expensive. The occupation was becoming unpopular. Resistance was rising. Something had to change. But Britain could not afford to simply leave. Churchill jokingly called this gathering the 40 Thieves, but the work was serious. Over 2 weeks, in hotel rooms and in formal sessions, these officials redrew the map of the entire Middle East. The solution they arrived at was elegant, and it was designed to be cheaper than traditional occupation while still maintaining British control. Instead of governing through direct military rule, Britain would rule through local monarchs, leaders who would be nominally independent, but who would answer to British advisors and British military presence. Cheap to maintain, easier to justify, a monarchy looked more legitimate than a colonial governor. And for Iraq specifically, they had already decided who the king would be. It would be Faisal ibn Hussein, the same Faisal who had led the Arab revolt, the same Faisal whose family had been promised independence, the same Faisal who had been exiled by the French from Syria just months earlier. He had nowhere else to go. He needed a throne. Britain needed a monarch who would accept British control while still looking like he was leading an Arab nation. It was a perfect fit, if you ignored the fact that Faisal had no roots in Iraq, no family connections to Iraq, and no constituency in Iraq demanding his rule. He was being offered a crown that Britain had manufactured for him. But before they could crown him, they had to decide what exactly Iraq would be. And this is where the map came out. In the hotel rooms of the Semiramis, with Churchill's approval, Gertrude Bell and Percy Cox literally drew lines on a map, combining Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra into a single political unit for the first time in history. The lines were not drawn to match ethnic boundaries or tribal territories or religious populations. They were drawn to include the oil-rich province of Mosul, which had been in dispute with Turkey, within British-controlled Iraq. They were drawn to create a coherent territory that could be governed through a single monarchy, that could be administered by a small number of British advisors, and that would give Britain direct control over some of the richest oil fields in the world. The nation was being assembled like a machine, with each part chosen for how it fit into the whole. When the conference ended on March 22, 1921, Churchill cabled back to London with the news. The problem had been solved. The new countries had been designed. The monarchs had been selected. The map was drawn. Within 6 months, Faisal would be crowned king of a nation that had been invented in a hotel in Egypt by men who had never lived in it, could not govern it directly, and would never call it by any name other than a problem that had been solved. On July 16, 1921, the doors opened to what the British called a plebiscite, or referendum in Iraq. For the next 26 days, through August 11th, Iraqi notables, tribal leaders, and community representatives were invited to cast their vote on a single question: should Faisal ibn Hussein be king of Iraq? The mechanics of this referendum were, on the surface, democratic. The reality was something else entirely. British political officers had already conducted what they called a canvassing operation, moving through the territories to meet with the major tribal sheikhs, urban notables, and religious leaders. The purpose of these meetings was not to gauge what these leaders actually wanted. It was to explain to them what the outcome would be, and to secure their cooperation in making it happen. Those who were likely to cooperate were brought into the process. Those who were not, those who had their own ambitions for power in the new Iraqi state, were quietly removed from the equation. In at least one documented case, a significant rival to Faisal, with an independent power base, was exiled from the country before the voting even began, eliminating any possibility of organized opposition. The voting itself, conducted over nearly a month, was supervised at every level by British officials. The ballots were counted by British officials. The results were compiled by British officials and announced by British officials. On August 19, 1921, the outcome was declared 96% approval. 96% of those consulted had voted yes. To understand what that number actually means, consider the context. Iraq, as a political unit, was less than 5 months old at that point. It had no shared history, no unified identity, and deep internal divisions, tribal, ethnic, religious, that had been carved into this territory by centuries of separate governance. The populations of Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra had never united around a single leader. Many of them had never even thought of themselves as part of a single political entity. And yet, according to the official results, 96% of the people consulted had somehow agreed instantaneously that a foreign prince, a man with no family connections to Iraq, no constituency within Iraq, no roots in Iraq at all, should be crowned as their monarch. The explanation is simple. The British did not ask the broad population. They asked the people they had already decided would say yes, and they supervised the asking in a way that made saying no impossible for anyone who wanted to remain in power, in business, or in the country. It was not democracy. It was not even a close approximation of democracy. It was the manufacturing of consent by an occupation power, the appearance of legitimacy constructed entirely for external consumption. On August 23, 1921, as temperatures climbed toward 105 degrees Fahrenheit, approximately 1,500 dignitaries and notables assembled in the courtyard of a government building on the banks of the Tigris River in Baghdad. For most of them, this was the first time they had ever been gathered together as a single national assembly. British Army officers, in full dress uniform, stood alongside Shiite Arabs from Basra near the Persian Gulf, Kurds from Mosul near the Turkish border, and Sunni Arabs from Baghdad. It was a careful choreography, the visible unity of a nation that had never been united, made present in a single space for the first time in history. Faisal, dressed in formal robes and the regalia of an Arab prince, processed through the crowd. Religious leaders offered prayers. Tribal leaders voiced their assent. The crown, physical, symbolic, real, was placed on his head. In that moment, according to the official narrative, Iraq officially became a nation, and a people had chosen their king. What actually happened was different. Faisal was a man installed in power by a foreign state, to rule over a country that the same foreign state had designed and drawn on a map, using territories that had never been unified, in service of interests, oil, strategic control, imperial efficiency, that had nothing to do with the will of the people being crowned before him. Faisal himself understood this contradiction acutely. Before accepting the throne, he had written privately to the British, expressing deep reservations about whether he could govern a nation that had been assembled by foreign hands, stitched together from incompatible populations, and offered to him as a political solution to a British problem. But he also understood his own position. He was a stateless prince, a man without a country, offered a crown that he desperately needed. He accepted. By the end of 1921, 9 months after Churchill first convened the Cairo Conference, the transformation was complete and irreversible. 3 separate Ottoman provinces had been welded into a single nation. A foreign prince had been crowned as its king under conditions entirely controlled by the power that had created the country itself. And the map that would define the Middle East for the next century, a map drawn not for the people who lived on it, but for the interests of those who had drawn it, had been locked into place. Everything that followed, the tensions, the instability, the conflicts that would ripple across generations, flowed directly from choices made in a hotel in Cairo, on maps drawn in Cairo, by men who had never lived in Iraq and never would. What remained was only to see whether the artificial nation they had invented could actually survive the contradictions that had brought it into being. The crown was placed on Faisal's head in August of 1921. Within weeks, the reality of ruling a nation that had been assembled by others began to manifest itself in ways that even British planners had not fully anticipated. Faisal inherited a kingdom that was unified on paper and fractured in nearly every other way. The Kurds in Mosul looked toward Turkey and toward their own tribal autonomy, not toward Baghdad. The Shiites in Basra, who made up a significant majority of Iraq's population, had never wanted to accept the authority of a Sunni Hashemite dynasty. They had their own religious leadership, their own economic networks, their own reasons to resist central authority. The Baghdad elites resented what they correctly understood as British tutelage disguised as Iraqi sovereignty. Tribal leaders outside the cities recognized no central government at all. Within months of his coronation, Faisal faced what amounted to a genuine insurgency, not from outside the nation, but from populations living within the borders of the state that had supposedly just voted 96% to accept his rule. By 1922, the British were committing tens of thousands of troops to suppress what would come to be known as the Iraqi Revolt. But a larger problem emerged almost immediately, and it came from an external power with its own claims to the territory that Churchill and Bell had drawn into Iraq's borders. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed after the First World War, the vast territories it had controlled were divided among the victorious Allied powers. Turkey, the Ottoman rump state, was reduced to the core Anatolian homeland that had been its ethnic and historic center. The Treaty of Lausanne, signed in 1923, officially confirmed these new borders, but there was one piece of territory that both Turkey and the newly created Iraqi state claimed, and that piece was Mosul, the northern province that Britain had deliberately drawn into the new nation, specifically because of what lay beneath it. Under Mosul's soil lay the estimated richest untapped oil reserves in the entire region, not in Persia, not in Arabia, but in Mosul. This was why Mosul mattered. This was why it had been included in Iraq's borders. This was why Britain would fight to keep it there. Turkey wanted Mosul for the same reason, the oil. The British wanted Iraq to have Mosul because they controlled Iraq, and therefore they would control the oil. The question was not about identity or ethnicity or the will of Mosul's inhabitants. The question was about who would extract and profit from the oil reserves buried there. Turkey made the case for its claim. Mosul had been an Ottoman province for centuries. After the war, when the empire was dissolved, Turkey believed that Mosul should revert to Turkish sovereignty. It was a reasonable historical argument, but it was not the argument that would decide the matter. Instead of allowing Britain and Turkey to negotiate directly, which might have given Turkey an opportunity to leverage its historical claim, the dispute was brought before the League of Nations. This was, ostensibly, exactly what the League was designed to do: settle territorial disputes between nations through international law and investigation rather than through war. In 1924, the League of Nations appointed an investigative mission to travel to Mosul and determine which nation had the strongest claim. The mission spent months in the territory. They interviewed local officials, tribal leaders, urban elites, religious authorities. They examined Ottoman records and historical documents. They assessed the military and administrative capacity of both nations. What they found was politically inconvenient. The population of Mosul was mixed. There were Sunni Arabs, Kurds, other minorities. There was no overwhelming majority supporting either Turkey or Iraq. Both nations could make plausible arguments based on history, on population, on strategic necessity. The League's commission issued its recommendation in 1925. And here is what they decided. The deciding factor would not be the will of Mosul's inhabitants. The deciding factor would be administrative efficiency and long-term stability. Iraq, despite its recent creation and its artificial construction, had proven itself to be a more cohesive state structure than a fragmenting Turkey. Iraq's government, though propped up by British advisors, had shown the capacity to maintain order. Iraq could administer Mosul more effectively and more stably than Turkey could. Therefore, Mosul should remain part of Iraq. Turkey accepted the decision. In 1926, the League's arbitration was formalized and confirmed. Mosul, and its oil, stayed within Iraq's borders. On the surface, this appears to be a triumph for Faisal and for the Iraqi nation. The League of Nations had validated Iraq's existence as a legitimate state. It had confirmed Iraq's territorial integrity. The nation had survived its first major test, the borders held. But look at what had actually happened. The League of Nations had essentially confirmed that the political boundaries Churchill and Gertrude Bell had drawn in Cairo in 1921 were correct and would remain fixed. The League had legitimized the principle that access to natural resources, not ethnicity, not religion, not the stated preferences of the people living in a territory, would determine which nation had sovereignty over that territory. Mosul remained part of Iraq, not because the people of Mosul had voted to be part of Iraq, and not because Mosul naturally belonged with Baghdad and Basra. Mosul remained part of Iraq because the Mosul oil fields had been accounted for in Britain's calculations of imperial interest, and because the international system of 1925 was structured in a way that validated exactly that kind of decision. The map that had been drawn in Cairo in 1921 became, in 1926, officially permanent, not because it reflected the will of the people who lived on it, not because it united populations that shared a common identity or common purpose, but because it served the interests of the power that had drawn it, and because the international order of the time existed, in large part, to legitimate exactly that arrangement. The nation invented in a Cairo hotel was going to survive, not because it was real, not because it was legitimate, but because it was profitable. And in the calculation of empires, profitability was enough. The story of Iraq is not an accident of history. It is not the result of a single man's ambition or a single moment of poor judgment. It is the result of a pattern, a way of organizing the world that was common to empires, especially the British Empire, in the early 20th century. The pattern is this: identify a resource that matters: oil, minerals, agricultural land, strategic position. Identify a territory where that resource exists. Identify the populations living in that territory. Then, ignore those populations and draw lines on a map in a way that serves the interests of the power doing the drawing. Install leaders who are amenable to foreign control. Manufacture the appearance of legitimacy through votes and plebiscites and international institutions. Call it independence, call it self-determination, call it nation-building. Then move on to the next problem. What makes this pattern so difficult to see is that it works. It actually works. Iraq survived the artificial stitching together of 3 provinces. A nation that should have fallen apart held together, at least for a while, because the British had enough military power and financial resources to make it hold together. The monarchy lasted. The government, though always fragile, never completely dissolved. From the perspective of empire, it was a success. A problem had been solved. A resource had been secured. A region had been brought under control. But look at what the pattern costs. Faisal Mun. I ruled Iraq for 12 years. He died in 1933, at the age of 48, under circumstances that remain historically ambiguous. His son succeeded him. The kingdom he left behind was marginally more stable than when he had received it, but it was not a real nation. It was a state, a political structure maintained by an outside power. The moment that outside power withdrew its support, the structure began to crack. By 1958, 37 years after the Cairo Conference, the monarchy was overthrown in a military coup. The king was assassinated. The state that Britain had so carefully constructed fell apart almost overnight. But by that time, the map had already done its work. The borders that Churchill and Bell had drawn had been recognized internationally. They had been written into treaties. They had become, through repetition and time, and the weight of international law, real, even though the nation they enclosed had never developed a genuine shared identity. Even though the populations inside those borders had never become a unified people, and the oil that had been the reason those borders were drawn in the first place, that oil remained. It was extracted and sold and fought over for a century. The resource that had justified the artificial nation had also, by some measure, kept that nation in being, because as long as there was oil, there was a reason for outside powers to care about who ruled Iraq and how. As long as there was a resource worth controlling, the structure persisted. The nation may have been artificial, but the stakes were real. Today, more than 100 years after the Cairo Conference, those borders still exist. Iraq is still a nation where Kurds, Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, and other populations struggle to imagine themselves as part of a single political entity. That struggle is not because those populations are incapable of coexistence. It is because the nation they were forced into was never built for them. It was built for oil, for strategic position, for the interests of a power that no longer directly rules them. The contradictions that Churchill and Bell inscribed into the map in 1921 are still there. They have not gone away. They have only metastasized. This is why we study history, not to make moral judgments about the past, and not to assign blame to people long dead, but to see how decisions made by people in power, decisions that seemed rational at the time, decisions that served real interests, decisions that were documented in official records, can echo across generations and shape the lives of millions of people who had no say in how those decisions were made. Iraq's borders were not inevitable. They were not the natural expression of geography, or ethnicity, or religion. They were not the choice of the people who lived there. They were a choice, a specific choice made by specific people, in a specific place, in a specific year, for specific reasons. The reasons were documented. The people were named. The place was a hotel in Cairo. The year was 1921. And everything that followed, 100 years of consequence, flowed directly from that choice. If this video helped you understand how the hidden decisions of yesterday shaped the world we live in today, please like and subscribe. We make videos about the origin stories of the systems that run your life, the histories that your schools probably skipped over, the decisions that were made long before you were born, and the patterns that connect them. New episodes every 2 weeks. Do you think the map should have been drawn differently? Or do you think the decision to create Iraq was right, given what Britain faced at the time? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to understand more about how great powers divide up the world, watch the previous episode. America had no Social Security healthcare until 1965. What happened when you got sick? A story about another time when decisions made a century ago are still shaping who gets access to what and why.